It started with a flash one screen, then two, then the entire wall. Deep in a bunker outside Moscow, the nerve center of Soviet Strategic Command lit up in crimson. Alarms wailed, phones rang, screens scrolled faster than the human eye could follow. And in the middle of it all, a junior signals officer stared in horror at the code string blinking on his console. He hadn't sent it. Yet the system said otherwise. Launch authorization sequence initiated. A command that was supposed to take multiple layers of verification. Multiple keys, multiple voices had somehow begun to propagate. In theory, that should have been impossible. In practice, the safeguards were only as good as the men who followed them. And tonight, one of them had made a mistake. Within seconds, officers flooded the war room, chairs overturned. A colonel sprinted to the manual override console, hand trembling as he entered a counter code. A general barked into the phone to cancel all downstream actions. But the code string had already reached outposts' missile silos that interpreted the signal not as an error, but as go time. All it would take was one silo, one operator trusting the machine more than his instincts. In a hardened facility 800 kilometers away, a silo commander turned his key halfway before his second man screamed. "Stand down!" The code wasn't verified by the backup channel. The second layer hadn't lit green. Something was wrong. They froze. That freeze saved the world. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a secure vault beneath the Pentagon, NORAD's alert monitors caught the Soviet comms spike. It wasn't a missile launch, not yet, but it was something. Analysts scrambled. Satellites were retasked. The White House Situation Room lit up in the early hours of a quiet Tuesday with a single terrifying phrase: Soviet strategic forces may be preparing to fire. No one slept. Back in the bunker, the false signal was traced, not to a launch, not to a hack, but to a simple relay failure, compounded by a protocol test run at the wrong time, by the wrong person. It was not a dry run. It was not a drill. It was almost Armageddon. And then silence. No missiles launched, no retaliation, just men breathing heavily in dark rooms, suddenly aware of how fragile their control really was. Soviet Strategic Command had believed their system was foolproof. Tonight, they found out it wasn't even fool-resistant, and that, they knew, was far more dangerous than anything the Americans had ever built. The bunker had been designed to inspire confidence. 12-meter-thick concrete walls, triple-redundant power systems, hardened communication lines buried beneath kilometers of reinforced earth. If there was a place on Earth that could guarantee the safe management of nuclear command, Soviet planners believed this was it. They were wrong. For decades, the Soviets had built their entire deterrence structure on one sacred assumption: control was absolute. Orders would only ever be issued by the right people, at the right time. Using systems too secure to fail, layer after layer of procedural safety launch codes, voice verification, physical keys. Encrypted transmission bursts had lulled the system into a dangerous sense of self-assurance. The irony that confidence was never tested until it failed. In training exercises, every man knew his role. Every code was simulated. Every light, every beep, every command followed the script. But on that night, when a misrouted maintenance ping was misread by a line of code and interpreted as a launch directive, the entire system buckled. Not because of sabotage, not because of an enemy hack, but because of belief. Belief in the system. Belief that the safeguards would hold. No one had anticipated the human side of failure. A sleepy night shift. A junior coder patching a subroutine without a supervisor. A relay node in the Kirov network echoing a test signal across the live grid. And most critically, no protocol existed for how to undo a launch signal that was never meant to be sent. Inside the strategic command bunker, colonels argued over whose authority would prevail in such an unlisted scenario. The codes had been triggered, but hadn't fully authenticated. Half the outposts stood down. The other half waited in a state of paralyzed alert, staring at instruments that whispered war without ever shouting it. In the confusion, one terrifying thought passed among the top brass like a ghost. What if the Americans had seen it? Because even the perception of Soviet launch preparation could be misread. The U.S. had its own hair trigger alert system. A premature warning could lead to escalation. And the Soviets knew it. This was supposed to be the most tightly choreographed sequence in the entire Soviet military structure. Instead, it was chaos wearing the mask of command. And it had exposed the fatal contradiction at the heart of Soviet strategy. They believed they controlled the apocalypse, but their system had just reminded them control is an illusion. All it took was one wrong line of code echoed at the wrong moment to reveal that their fortress of logic was built atop a minefield of assumptions. They didn't need spies. They didn't need NATO to infiltrate their networks. They just needed one man, one terminal, and one oversight. And for one night in the Cold War, that was nearly enough to end the world. For decades, Soviet nuclear doctrine had been built on two foundational pillars: central control and rapid retaliation. The first was supposed to prevent unauthorized use. The second was designed to ensure that, if the motherland was ever attacked, it could strike back before being annihilated. This balance of power, tight internal control, paired with swift external fury, was what Soviet leaders believed would keep the peace. But peace built on contradiction is not peace. It's a countdown. The Soviet Union had always mocked the West's nuclear posture as reckless. American systems, with their multiple launch authorities and decentralized assets, seemed chaotic to Soviet planners. The USSR, by contrast, centralized everything. From code generation to missile command, the power was locked within a vertical command structure trusted only to a select few at the very top. But that centralization was brittle. And the incident in the bunker exposed the fatal truth: when you centralize everything, a single error doesn't ripple, it fractures. The event forced Soviet command to confront something their doctrine had never accounted for: internal mistakes. Their philosophy assumed threats would always come from outside spies, sabotage, NATO provocations. But no line in their protocol ever seriously considered that the system might turn on itself through procedural failure. In a war game scenario, that would be unthinkable. In reality, it almost happened. The design of the Soviet launch architecture was elegant on paper, but flawed in execution. It assumed perfect obedience, flawless signals, and human infallibility under pressure. No doctrine had seriously asked what would happen if a man hesitated, or worse, if he didn't. The launch code propagation event, though ultimately halted, left no doubt Soviet command had created a weaponized paradox. The system had to be fast enough to retaliate in minutes, but slow enough to ensure certainty. That balance had just failed. And at the core of that failure was something doctrine could never compensate for: fear. In the aftermath of the incident, closed-door meetings across the Politburo and strategic rocket forces did not begin with technical questions. they began with silence, with senior officers asking one another, in quiet tones, what if it had gone through, and worse, what if we couldn't stop it next time? The truth was clear. The Soviet doctrine, once the pride of military theorists in Moscow, was now exposed as a ticking clock wired to human nerves. The system hadn't just failed. Technically, it had failed philosophically. Because in the end, it wasn't NATO's nuclear arsenal that almost ended the Cold War. It was the Soviets' own belief that their system could never make a mistake. That belief was dead now. And every officer in that room knew it. It began with a flicker. At exactly 02:14 Moscow Standard Time, a signal packet labeled with the prefix K400 Alpha propagated from a secondary node in the Far East communication array. To the untrained eye, it was routine, just a check-in ping from a regional command relay, something that happened thousands of times each day. But buried within that string of characters was a sequence resembling an early-stage activation code, and the system noticed. Within milliseconds, it was logged, escalated, and automatically verified by the initial failsafe. Step 1 of a 5-stage launch protocol. It wasn't a full go code, but it was enough to trigger a low-level alert in the launch queue buffer, enough to push lights from green to yellow in silos from Orenburg to Irkutsk. That wasn't supposed to be possible. These nodes were designed to isolate training signals from operational networks, but a software update pushed earlier that week, meant to streamline packet parsing, had inadvertently removed that barrier. The impossible had just become real. Within moments, launch controllers across multiple missile sites began receiving Level 2 activation prompts. Initiate key verification. Await primary unlock sequence. Some units assumed it was a drill, others did not. In Ukraine, at a hardened facility near Pervomaisk, a captain named Gennady Mirov reached for his launch key. His hands trembled not from fear, but from discipline. He'd been trained to act, not question. The lights were yellow, the screens were waiting, and the protocol was clear: prepare. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a technician monitoring the alert queue hesitated. His name was erased from records later, but in that moment, his pause saved the world. He didn't override the system. He simply didn't act. For 73 seconds, the Soviet Union stood on the edge of unintentional annihilation. A ghost code born from a flawed patch, echoed by an innocent maintenance signal, was climbing through the launch protocol. One more step, and it would have reached authentication challenge, the irreversible phase, high above the confusion. Early warning satellites designed to spot American ICBM launches reported nothing. No heat blooms, no missile trails, just silence. That silence was the only thing louder than panic. Phones rang, officers yelled, cipher rooms scrambled to confirm whether the signal was real. But the system didn't care. It wasn't built to wait for confirmation, it was built to move, fast and blind, if the codes lined up. And for 73 seconds, they did. Then, the technician overrode the sequence manually, and the world exhaled. When news reached the Politburo hours later, one question rang louder than all others. What if he hadn't? That night, no missile launched, no city vanished. But in Soviet command circles, one truth detonated quietly: the system had armed itself. Without war, without warning, and almost without humans. The reports came in waves, quiet, fragmented, and incomplete. At first, the incident was treated as a technical error, an internal blip, something to be logged and buried. the kind of anomaly that could be dismissed with a one-page memo and a tighter software patch. But by dawn, denial was no longer an option. The chain of command had been activated almost completely. Field officers had reached Phase 3 warhead arming preparation, one node away from launch authentication. And the scariest part, it had all complied with protocol. Nothing about the near miss was illegal or malicious. It was procedural, and that shook the Kremlin to its core. Inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense, senior officers gathered around a secure table. Phones were removed. Windows were shielded. A single document sat in the middle of the room, marked with the crimson seal reserved for nuclear command. It described the incident in clean language, but there was nothing clean about what had happened. Marshal Viktor Kulikov, then chief of the General Staff, refused to believe it at first. "It's a mistake," he said. "No unauthorized launch signal can pass through Tier 1 without being caught." But the room was silent. No one corrected him. No one agreed. Because Kulikov knew the truth already. The report didn't claim an unauthorized launch. It documented an authorized sequence built on a mistaken origin. A system designed to catch foreign attacks had nearly self-initiated not from sabotage, but from a code fragment mislabeled by the internal update. A war nearly launched by an automated clerical error. Soviet leadership, long proud of their rigid top-down control, faced a terrifying irony. The very architecture they'd trusted to prevent catastrophe had now made one more likely. Still, the first reaction from Moscow's upper circle wasn't reform. It was suppression. Kulikov and other marshals demanded the event be classified ultra-secret. Only those with Strategic Rocket Forces clearance would be allowed to view the logs. Technicians who raised the first alarms were quietly rotated out of sensitive posts. Some disappeared entirely from rosters. Publicly, nothing had happened. Privately, everyone was watching everyone else. And then came the directive. No mention of the failure in internal memos, no acknowledgement to foreign counterparts, and absolutely no deviation from the public doctrine that Soviet control systems were the most secure in the world. Even as they buried the evidence, High Command doubled the drills, simulated code sequences, redundancy checks. But beneath the surface, no one believed the safeguards anymore. Because if the system had nearly launched once, it could again. And next time, they might not be lucky enough to have a technician who hesitated. The first explanation drafted in response to the near launch was not technical. It was political. Within 48 hours of the incident, a classified memo from the 16th Directorate of Military Counterintelligence landed on Marshal Kulikov's desk. Its conclusion was blunt. Foreign interference remains the highest probability vector for protocol corruption. In other words, they blamed the CIA. The theory was compelling, if only because it was convenient. A malicious actor had supposedly introduced a spoofed signal through an unsecured maintenance relay. This, they claimed, was an attempted soft launch, a U.S. test, to see how close the Soviets could be pushed before fully arming their warheads. To some, it made perfect sense. After all, U.S. reconnaissance satellites had been caught trailing over Soviet relay zones in the previous months. NSA listening posts in Turkey had grown bolder, and communications sniffers off Vladivostok had detected unidentifiable pings in radar bands. Surely, the Americans were poking holes. It was easier to believe in espionage than in systemic failure. A task force was assembled. Code auditors were pulled from East German signals teams. Dozens of Soviet cyber engineers were ordered to search for evidence of American code signatures' fingerprints, backdoors, anything, but they found nothing, because it wasn't there. Still, the narrative stuck. By framing the error as a hostile intrusion, High Command could maintain the illusion that the system itself was sound. The problem wasn't Soviet engineering, it was sabotage. And sabotage could be fixed with more surveillance, more firewalls, more purges. So that's what they did. By the end of the month, 12 software engineers had been demoted, 3 arrested for security lapses, and a new doctrine was issued: no external updates without multi-agency verification. On paper, it sounded like reform. In reality, it was fear disguised as control. But a few voices inside the system weren't convinced. A low-ranking signals analyst name redacted in later archives noted a strange pattern. The failed signal had originated not from a foreign line, but from inside the Soviet infrastructure, a domestic echo, a glitch that read like a shadow of itself. He raised the issue. He was ignored. Because in a state built on infallibility, the truth was the most dangerous signal of all. The CIA wasn't the culprit. There was no foreign interference. The near launch had been triggered by the system itself, by a flaw born in Soviet code, labeled by Soviet hands, and nearly fatal to Soviet cities. But as long as the foreign threat theory held, no one had to fix the core problem. And that made the next near catastrophe not just possible, but inevitable. When the espionage narrative began to crumble under technical scrutiny, Soviet officials pivoted not toward transparency, but to an even darker explanation: internal sabotage. This time, they didn't blame the CIA. They blamed their own. The second wrong theory took shape inside the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, the division responsible for communications security. Their revised report proposed a chilling possibility: a rogue insider, working deep within the strategic rocket forces, had inserted a malformed signal into the launch queue, not as an error, but as a message, a test of loyalty, a trial run, a potential coup, to Soviet leadership, already steeped in paranoia. The theory felt disturbingly plausible. The Brezhnev era had taught them that threats didn't always come from across the ocean, they often came from across the hallway. And here was a system, one of their most sacred military command chains, that had nearly green-lit Armageddon without anyone's direct order. That wasn't a bug, they said. That was intent. The narrative gained traction fast. A full background sweep of personnel was ordered, everyone with Tier 1 code access, including maintenance crews, software auditors, and even logistics officers. The process wasn't surgical. It was sweeping and brutal. Dozens were detained. 4 were tried behind closed doors for deliberate compromise of strategic assets. 2 were sentenced to long-term imprisonment in undisclosed locations. No evidence was ever presented publicly. No appeals were allowed. The message was clear: if someone inside had attempted to test the system, they'd now think twice. But behind that state theater, the real problem remained untouched. Because this second theory, like the first, was wrong. There was no saboteur, no rogue defector, no political plot. The corrupted signal that had nearly started World War III wasn't authored by a human hand. It was the result of a software cascade triggered by a clock synchronization fault in a long-range relay. In plain terms, 2 computers, thousands of miles apart, processed an outdated signal as if it were new. The result? An old test packet was treated as an active Go code. No spy, no mole, just outdated firmware, and a terrifying hole in the Soviets' most guarded system. But the truth was too fragile, too inconvenient. Because to admit that a software sync error had brought the world to the edge of nuclear war would be to admit that the USSR's most powerful weapons weren't under command. They were under chance. And so the second wrong theory, like the first, was locked into the record. Fabricated certainty replaced terrifying doubt. The archives were sealed. The purge went quiet. And the bug that almost started World War III, it was still there, waiting. The most sophisticated intelligence network in the Soviet Union didn't see it coming. The KGB's signals branch, the GRU's technical liaison officers, the elite mathematicians at the Ministry of Radio Technology, none of them detected the fatal flaw hiding inside the launch command system, a flaw that almost turned a routine signal pulse into the ignition of nuclear war. But this wasn't just a technical failure. It was a cultural collapse. Inside Soviet intelligence, confidence was armor. For decades, the system had operated on a bedrock assumption that centralized control, strict compartmentalization, and state censorship created security. The tighter the grip, the safer the state. But that grip had a cost. It bred blind spots. The launch code scare exposed something far more dangerous than a misfire. It exposed the fact that the Soviet system couldn't admit its own failures. And when it couldn't admit failure, it couldn't learn. The real danger wasn't the corrupted signal, it was the silence that followed. The NSA, watching from the other side of the Iron Curtain, caught pieces of the Soviet reaction. Satellite intercepts showed a flurry of repositioning around key command posts. Encrypted chatter from KGB relay stations doubled in volume for a full week. From an outsider's view, it looked like a successful security audit. But internally, nothing fundamental had changed. American analysts inside the CIA's Mirror Command Team, the Cold War's black budget unit dedicated to reverse engineering Soviet response behavior, were stunned. One decrypted memo between Langley and the U.S. Air Force read, "Soviet launch protocols are more brittle than anticipated. Network does not appear resilient to failure. Single-point errors cascade." The U.S. didn't celebrate this. They feared it. Because an adversary with fragile controls isn't just vulnerable, they're volatile. The scariest enemy isn't the one with superior weapons. It's the one who might launch by mistake and not be able to stop it. That was the hidden revelation buried beneath the Soviet cover-up. A launch nearly occurred, not by treason or intrusion, but by latency. Milliseconds of unsynchronized timing had almost triggered megatons of destruction, and not a single Soviet intelligence agency had modeled for it. This was the moment American strategic planners realized something chilling. They might be playing chess against an opponent who didn't even understand the game board. Soviet arrogance had blinded Soviet intelligence. Their belief in the perfection of their system had made them ignore the system's own warnings. And now, the only reason catastrophe had been averted was luck. The packet had expired just seconds before the failsafe reached the threshold. A buried failsafe command from a satellite relay contradicted the corrupted order, creating a signal conflict. That single contradiction prevented the next step, arming warheads. It wasn't design, it wasn't foresight. It was a cosmic glitch. And the next time, that glitch might not save them. As the CIA quietly updated its risk assessments, and American missile crews ran silent drills based on the incident's signature, one thing became clear to U.S. command, the most dangerous part of the Soviet arsenal, wasn't the warhead count. It was the illusion that someone was in control. While Soviet command structures were cracking under the pressure of secrecy, fear, and denial, the American response to the incident revealed something the Kremlin had never truly understood. The true American system wasn't built on perfection. It was built on failure. From the very beginning of the Cold War, U.S. military doctrine operated on a foundational assumption that no system, no matter how advanced, is immune to breakdown. And so, instead of seeking invulnerability, the United States invested in resilience. The architecture of American nuclear command was designed to survive chaos, not avoid it. Redundancies were layered into every control channel. Launch authorities required multi-tier verification. Independent teams verified signal integrity across multiple time zones, and encrypted authentication systems ensured that one node's error wouldn't trigger Armageddon. It was not elegant, but it was adaptable. When the Soviets learned of the corrupted signal scare within their own ranks, they doubled down on information lockdown. When the Americans found out through intercepted telemetry and back-channeled intelligence, they ran simulations. Within 48 hours, Stratcom had circulated a full theoretical reconstruction of the Soviet failure, complete with timelines, alternate failure paths, and proposed American countermeasures. NORAD drilled new alert scenarios. The NSA rewrote protocol for packet authentication. By the end of the week, every major U.S. command post had been briefed, not to assign blame, to anticipate the next version. That was the difference. Where the Soviet military machine demanded obedience, the American system demanded feedback. Where Moscow silenced its engineers, Washington's defense contractors were rewarded for finding flaws. Even inside nuclear command, the culture of continuous audit prevailed. The Strategic Air Command, the backbone of America's Cold War deterrent, was built around this ethos. SAC operated with a brutal honesty every system could fail. Every process was suspect, and every safeguard had to be tested under stress. Regularly, without warning. It wasn't paranoia, it was design. And that design paid off. Because by the early 1980s, the U.S. had deployed decentralized early warning systems that no longer depended on a single line of data. Satellite imagery, radar telemetry, acoustic sensors, airborne control platforms all cross-referenced in real time. A corrupted packet in one node wouldn't trigger a launch. It would trigger a cascade of validation checks, cross-system scrubs, and human review. Contrast that with the Soviet model: centralized, siloed, and fragile. The Americans didn't just know how to build missiles. They knew how to prevent one from launching by mistake. One chilling document, declassified decades later, showed that in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet code scare, the U.S. Joint Chiefs ran a war game with a haunting title, Dead Hand at Dawn. The scenario explored what might happen if the Soviets launched a nuclear attack due to a technical error and didn't know how to stop it. The simulation concluded in under an hour. Over 160 million dead. No diplomacy, no time. Just machine logic. Pushed beyond human reach. And so the Americans retooled again. New software patches, new communication mirrors, even anti-failure decoys, electronic ghosts in the network designed to delay rogue commands by mimicking validation responses long enough for human override. It wasn't science fiction. It was Cold War necessity. Because the Americans understood that the true threat wasn't just Soviet aggression, it was Soviet instability. A regime so secretive it couldn't audit itself. A command structure so brittle it could confuse silence for confirmation. A launch code network so afraid of Western infiltration that it risked internal collapse just to stay hidden. And that realization reshaped the final decade of U.S. doctrine. No longer was the mission just deterrence, it was containment of the Soviets' own dysfunction. American intelligence would now focus not only on missile counts or tank divisions, but on systems health, leadership stability, and communication latency. Because in the end, the true American system wasn't just about building a bigger arsenal, it was about making sure it never fired by mistake. And if that day ever came, it wouldn't be because someone forgot to plan. It would be because the other side never did. There was no explosion, no mushroom cloud, no declaration of war, and yet, within the quiet halls of the Kremlin, something far more devastating had occurred. The Soviet Union had been exposed not by an American weapon, but by its own system's inability to correct a mistake. That was the humiliation. In Soviet strategic culture, appearances mattered more than accuracy. Projecting invincibility was doctrine. Admitting vulnerability was unthinkable. But now, deep inside the nerve centers of the USSR's nuclear command, the unthinkable had happened. They had come within seconds of launching a missile by accident, and had no idea how to stop it. Word of the incident never reached the frontline generals. It didn't have to. They noticed something else: drills intensified. Communications blacked out without warning. Whole divisions were reassigned with no explanation. When Western analysts picked up on the movement patterns, it looked like a mobilization. In truth, it was a cover-up. Soviet command had ordered a massive internal reshuffling not to fix the problem, but to bury it. Engineers were reassigned. Logs were rewritten. One of the top communication directors disappeared entirely from official records. But the Americans knew. Thanks to SIGINT intercepts and defectors in key ministries, CIA analysts reconstructed the timeline. They tracked the erratic data bursts from Soviet radar sites. They recorded the gaps in standard protocol traffic. And they saw what the Soviets didn't want to admit: the entire strategic command structure had frozen in fear. And in doing so, it had proven its weakness. At Langley, one internal memo put it bluntly: Soviet launch deterrence compromised by internal opacity. Command paralysis observed. Opponent appears more afraid of error than defeat. It was a humiliating insight, one that would shape U.S. pressure strategies for the rest of the Cold War. Rather than provoking confrontation, America would let the Soviet system collapse under its own contradictions. The goal wasn't to win the nuclear arms race, it was to show the other side they were already losing it. That humiliation echoed all the way down to the tactical level. Soviet missile officers, once proud stewards of the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, now trained under rules that no longer made sense even to them. They were given protocols they couldn't question, told to follow commands they couldn't verify, and forced to act as if nothing had ever gone wrong. But they knew better. The ghost of the near launch haunted the system. Every sudden blackout, every unexpected drill, every time a secure channel clicked open without warning, it could be that moment again. And that constant psychological pressure created what U.S. analysts would later call nuclear erosion, the slow breakdown of trust between operators and command. A silent war not between nations, but within a regime. America didn't have to fire a shot. The humiliation was internal. By the late 1980s, as Gorbachev's reforms attempted to modernize a system already cracking, this event remained classified at the highest levels. Even as the USSR sought openness, one secret stayed locked away the day they nearly destroyed the world by mistake. Because it wasn't just an error, it was a mirror. And what it showed the Soviet leadership was terrifying, not that the Americans were stronger, but that their own system was too brittle to survive the truth, to understand the collapse of Soviet grand strategy. You have to go back to what they feared most, not NATO tanks or American bombers, but something far more insidious: uncertainty. For decades, Soviet strategic doctrine was built on predictability: control every variable, monitor every signal, and never allow the unexpected. The idea was simple: if everything is known, nothing can surprise you. But now, after the near transmission of launch codes due to a corrupted signal, the Soviet high command could no longer pretend. Their system didn't control uncertainty, it amplified it. And that realization was devastating. Because if you can't trust your own command network to distinguish peace from annihilation, what do you trust? This was not just a military failure, it was a philosophical one. The USSR had built its entire strategic identity on the premise that it could manage escalation, that its system of surveillance, redundancy, and centralized control would allow it to avoid what it saw as the chaos of the West. American doctrine, with its decentralized communications and public oversight, was considered dangerous, an accident waiting to happen. But when the accident almost happened, it didn't happen in Washington. It happened in Moscow. That fact tore through the foundation of Soviet military thinking like a virus, quietly, relentlessly. Systems that had once seemed unshakable, like the Crocus secure comm network, the dead hand automatic retaliation program, and the early warning satellites, were now under suspicion, not from foreign enemies, but from Soviet analysts themselves. In internal briefings, new language appeared: redundant verification insufficient, command latency unacceptable, chain of command paralysis probable. And with each admission, another pillar of ideology cracked. This wasn't just about buttons and codes, it was about the myth of infallibility. For years, Soviet leaders believed their greatest strength was control. But control without feedback is not strength. It's blindness. And when a system becomes blind to its own limits, it doesn't take an enemy to bring it down. It only takes time. So began the quiet retreat. Investment in strategic infrastructure slowed. Training regimens were slashed. Young officers, seeing the contradictions, began to defect, sometimes literally, sometimes ideologically. Even among the top generals, a creeping doubt set in: if the system could fail once, who's to say it hadn't failed already? By 1991, as the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, the moment that had once been buried in secrecy came full circle. Western analysts would later describe it not as a singular event, but as a turning point in doctrine. Because from that day forward, Soviet strategy no longer revolved around dominance. It revolved around fear. Fear of its own systems. Fear of the silence between signals. Fear of the day the screen might flash again, and no one would know whether to answer. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a quiet unraveling. And buried within that unraveling was a moment almost unknown, almost unbelievable, when the world stood at the edge of nuclear fire because of a single signal, and a system too rigid to respond. Today, that moment is studied only in fragments declassified documents. Whisper-level memoirs, errant log entries that survived the Soviet collapse. No official in Moscow ever spoke of it openly. No broadcast acknowledged its danger. But for those who worked in the shadows of command, it never went away. It haunted their silence. It haunted every blinking light in every bunker. And it left behind a question more terrifying than any American missile. What if it happens again? Because the ghost of that night didn't die with the USSR. It lives on in every nuclear power with a centralized command system. In every false alarm dismissed by luck. In every protocol written under the assumption that human error won't happen twice. But it can. And it will. The United States learned a different lesson that night, not just about Soviet weakness, but about the fragility of deterrence itself. That even the best prepared adversary can be undone by a moment of uncertainty. That fear cold, invisible, and untraceable remains the true legacy of the Cold War. Not the weapons, not the doctrines, but the silence that followed a signal no one was ready to interpret. And so, as we look back on the story of a command system that nearly triggered catastrophe from within, we are left with one truth. The most dangerous weapons are not the ones that explode. They are the ones we build, trust, and then forget to question.